Good afternoon, Mr. Fontaine, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the latest installment in the RSIS Distinguished Public Lecture Series, and we are very happy this afternoon to have with us Mr. Richard Fontaine. Mr. Fontaine is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security, or CNAS. He served as President of CNAS from 2012 to 2019, and as before that Senior Fellow from 2009 to 2012. Prior to CNAS, he was Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator John McCain and served as the Minority Deputy Staff Director on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Mr. Fontaine has also served as Associate Director for Near Eastern Affairs at the National Security Council between 2003 and 2004, and he worked on Southeast Asian issues in the NSC's Asian Affairs Directorate. At the State Department, he worked for the Deputy Secretary in the Department's South Asia Bureau. Let me briefly provide the context for today's lecture. In 2011, the Obama administration announced its pivot or rebalance to Asia after a decade of prosecuting the war on terror and being focused on Afghanistan and the Middle East. The Asia-Pacific was and remains the fastest growing region in the world, and the Obama administration back then saw an opportunity for the US to benefit from the region's economic dynamism through trade and investment, as well as for Washington at the same time to promote human rights and democracy. The administration also recognized the need to rebalance to Asia in the face of China's spectacular rise as a global superpower and its impact on the region, especially its growing economic heft, rapid military modernization, and increased assertiveness in the South China Sea. The Obama pivot centered on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the deployment of new, enhanced, modernized military capabilities to the region was intended to reassure America's allies and partners in the Asia-Pacific and to demonstrate its enduring commitment to maintaining peace, prosperity, and stability in our region. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia did not come to pass, as we know, for reasons both foreign and domestic. And the Trump administration's subsequent policies and attitudes raised questions of America's commitment to the region. Today, the Biden administration has sought to rectify the situation. It issued its Indo-Pacific strategy in February 2022, which focuses on strengthening US engagement and partnerships in the region, promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, and addressing shared challenges like, of course, climate change. The Biden administration's renewed engagement in the region comes amidst, as we all know, intensifying great power competition and a rapidly deteriorating bilateral relationship between Beijing and Washington on multiple fronts, including trade, technology, human rights, democracy, Taiwan, South China Sea, and the Russian intervention in Ukraine. Not surprisingly, countries in our region are watching developments between the US and China closely. They do not want to have to choose between the two and will continue to hedge between Beijing and Washington. No country in the region wants to get sucked in and become a casualty of intense competition between the two great powers. Regional countries want their concerns on climate change, trade, global governance, and much else besides to be taken seriously and on their own terms. Regional countries, in short, naturally have a legitimate self-interested position that seeks the freedom to pursue their own national interests. At the same time, countries in the region are watching whether the US will do what it says it will do. The question we all have is whether the US is still committed to the region, and if so, for how long and to what extent. So with that context in mind, look forward to an interesting and insightful presentation this afternoon by Mr. Fontaine, and the title of the talk is The United States in the Indo-Pacific, Pivoting or Pretending. With that, Mr. Fontaine, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramakrishna, and thank you to RSIS for having me and to everybody for joining today. It's great to be back in Singapore, so grateful for the opportunity to get together today. So as the professor sort of glossed just a little bit. It's now been 12 years since the Obama administration announced that the United States would be pivoting to Asia, that Asia would be the priority region for the United States. It would receive a disproportionate share of national security resources, diplomatic attention, efforts toward trade policy and trade initiatives, and so forth. And you can see at the time the inner logic of this kind of thinking about the pivot to Asia. The notion was that after grinding wars in the greater Middle East, Europe was quiescent at the time. You didn't have this kind of resurgent Russia. So the notion was we're going to rebalance our global portfolio of national security activities to give Asia a much sort of bigger share of the pie, so to speak. And so by doing that, the United States would reap the dividends offered by Asia's economic dynamism. It would stabilize relations with China. It would deepen its alliance of partnerships in the world's most vital region. Of course, since 2011, a lot has happened, as this audience well knows, both in the world and in US politics. But it's interesting that the notion of putting Asia or the Indo-Pacific first in US foreign policy has actually endured over the past 12 years. The Trump administration sought its own variant on the pivot to Asia, even as its approach to China changed quite dramatically from its predecessor. Now the Biden administration is trying to give meaning to this strategic impulse and try to match actions and resources to that impulse. So the question that I'm going to try to shed a little light on is the United States now, at long last, actually pivoting to Asia, or is this pretending? Is this more rhetorical than anything else? What do we have to show for our decade plus of trying to do this? What other crises in other parts of the world have or might distract the United States from its focus on Asia? And of course, what is the role of China and US-China relations and all this? So I'm going to try to answer a couple of these questions by looking at the successes and challenges of recent US policy in the Indo-Pacific, how the US can focus on the Indo-Pacific while still remaining a global power, which it is and will remain, and what the current approach means and should mean for long-term competition with China. So first, what's the baseline? How would we actually measure and decide whether we were pivoting to Asia? Well, I think despite actually over a decade of stressing Asia's importance until recently, it's safe to say that US activity and action has not been commensurate with the commitment that has been made rhetorically. US military resources by most measures in the Indo-Pacific are about where they were when all of this was sort of announced 12 or so years ago. And of course that has happened while China's military has grown by leaps and bounds. So the overall military balance in the region from the American perspective has sort of deteriorated in the wrong direction. Diplomacy in Asia has been relatively erratic. It's depended a lot on what's going on around the world and also the personalities of who happens to be president or secretary of state at a given time and what their priorities are. And trade policy, as folks in Singapore know better than anyone, went kaput with the demise of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement in the United States, and it hasn't actually recovered since then. So the pivot to Asia was a wise strategic impulse, but the truth is we haven't had a whole lot to show for that attempt over the years. But I submit that in a number of key dimensions that's now changing. And this change flows from the bipartisan consensus in Washington that the United States is engaged in a long-term competition with China, one that will play out to a greater degree in the Indo-Pacific than in any other region in the world. And the Biden administration, like its predecessor, but unlike the Bush administration and the Obama administration, has repeatedly identified China as its foremost foreign policy challenge, and this is the driving impulse behind a lot of this. As one can see, I think pretty clearly, the US Department of Defense identifies China's, quote, its pacing challenge, and the Indo-Pacific as its priority theater. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has described China as, quote, the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. The National Security Strategy identifies China as the only country with, quote, both the will to refashion the international order to suit its autocratic preferences and increasingly the ability to do so. And I think most policymakers and most political leaders in Washington would broadly agree with those characterizations. So the consensus that has emerged around this, particularly around China and the challenge that China poses to the United States, is driving a raft of new efforts that aim to improve America's competitive position and link Washington more firmly with its allies and partners in Asia. You see this in a whole bunch of domestic moves just over the past year or two. So there's the CHIPS and Science Act, which directs some $50 billion towards semiconductor production in the United States. Defensive economic moves like the decision last fall to put export controls on the export of the highest end semiconductors, graphic processing units that are being used for supercomputing purposes in China. The administration launched AUKUS, this defense technology sharing platform between the United States, the UK, and Australia, and provide Australia with nuclear propelled submarines. It's reinvigorated the Quad. It's elevated that to a regular leader-level meeting, except for when the president can't go to the Quad because we're about to default on our debt, but we'll get back to that later. We're not actually going to default on our debt, but he probably will miss the Quad meeting in Australia, unfortunately. And they've established this set of Quad initiatives related to vaccines and other things like that. There's the Partners in the Blue Pacific initiative to coordinate Pacific Island assistance. We're opening embassies in places like Kiribati and Tonga. Promise to triple the aid to the Pacific, and President Biden hosted ASEAN leaders in Washington for their first ever sort of summit in Washington. The U.S. is plussing up its defense budget, allowing a greater share of resources of that to Asia and things like the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. There's IPEF, this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. It's no TPP, to be sure. It's not even really a trade agreement because it doesn't provide for market access. But it's better than nothing, and it's potentially a stepping stone towards something more ambitious. So all of these efforts are at their heart designed to put the United States and its allies and partners in position to deal more effectively with a rising China. And yet they're all taking place while the demand for US engagement in other areas and on other sets of issues remains high, obviously in Europe more than anywhere else, given the war in Ukraine and the aid that the United States is providing to Ukraine. But nevertheless, the fact that the United States is engaged in that kind of activity in Europe, but nevertheless is doing all of the things that I mentioned on the Asia front, suggests to me that at long last, the United States is actually pivoting to Asia. I think this time it is for real. This in turn raises the second issue that I mentioned at the beginning of this, which is the United States' nature as a global power. The United States it's not going to become a regional power focused only on Asia, only on China, only on the Indo-Pacific. American presidents discern interests all over the world. The United States is active on every continent. That's not going away, and so the question for American policymakers and for our friends and for our allies is how can the United States square its renewed attention to Asia with its commitments and engagements elsewhere? And this has always been, since this announcement, this kind of tension between what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Europe, especially those two regions, and what's happening in Asia. And these other commitments and risks and activities can't just be wished away. So consider that when the current administration took office, the president and his advisors hope to settle or at least manage some of these key international challenges that exist outside this kind of immediate region. So in order to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, they would get back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Donald Trump got out of. To stop provocative North Korean missile tests, they would get back into a negotiating process with Pyongyang. The United States would pursue what they called a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, and to free up military and financial resources that would be needed elsewhere. The United States was going to finally end the 20-year war in Afghanistan. And if we did all of those things successfully, it was thought the United States could then do what it had been trying to do for a decade, which is focus more intently on China and on Asia as Washington's priority region. You may have noticed that things didn't quite go according to plan on some of those fronts. So, North Korea refused talks and began firing off missiles at a pace faster than it ever had before, threatening new nuclear tests. Iran declined to re-enter the JCPOA. It's not back in the Iran nuclear deal now, and it's enriched uranium to a higher level than it ever has before. The United States withdrew chaotically from Afghanistan, but it's also left behind a country at risk of a reversion to a terror sanctuary. And then, of course, most significantly, Russia invaded Ukraine, launching the first major state-on-state land war in Europe since 1945, and it's shaken the very foundations of global politics and security. And this Russian invasion illustrates the kind of trade-offs that are inherent in these overall global foreign policies in trying to elevate a region like the Indo-Pacific. So if you look at how this played out as a practical matter, top foreign policy officials in Washington increasingly became consumed by the crisis in Russia and Ukraine and in Europe by late 2021, before the invasion had even begun. And then White House and State Department officials engaged in rather vigorous diplomacy with Moscow to try to head off an attack on Ukraine. The Treasury Department started working on sanctions that could be put into place at a level never before imposed on such a large economy. There was a lot of diplomacy to try to win foreign support for the sanctions and for other statements and so forth. The Defense Department and the intelligence community poured their own resources into the conflict. And then within weeks of Russia's attack, the United States increased its military presence in Europe by some 20,000 troops. South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore all joined the sanctions against Russia, provided assistance to Ukraine. And when President Biden hosted the ASEAN leaders at the White House, some of these disparities were on rather vivid display. So with some degree of fanfare, the White House announced $150 million of US investment in Southeast Asia. But the same week, the US Congress was preparing a $50 billion aid package for Ukraine. So these trade-offs are hard for a global power like the United States. So how do you make them? Well, when it comes to shifting military resources or diplomatic energy or leader-level attention from other issues or other regions to Asia, I think one thing to avoid is a simple do more mantra for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, the Indo-Pacific's a big place, so just doing more in Asia doesn't automatically mean that it's going to be doing more in a productive kind of way. But also, if we ignore the consequences for our interests in other regions of the world, we end up actually almost counterintuitively putting in peril the very focus on Asia that we're trying to achieve in the first place. That's because the price of focusing on Asia and on the long-run challenge of China is the absence of acute security crises in the Middle East and in Europe that would galvanize American attention and distract us from our priorities here. So consider a couple of past examples. We pulled troops out completely from Iraq in 2011. Part of the stated rationale at the time was we had sort of more important strategic priorities in Asia, needed to no longer be bogged down in resources and in other ways in the sands of the Middle East, and particularly in a fruitless war in Iraq. But those troops weren't redeployed to Asia. Instead, what we did was ensure that America was going to have to go back just 4 years later in a far more resource-intensive way than before to deal with ISIS, which had built the biggest terrorist sanctuary in history. The same may be, although I hope it's not, the case in Afghanistan. So sustaining a low level of US military presence, diplomatic engagement, or funding in some of these key non-Asia areas could at least, and paradoxically, permit Washington to actually pivot to Asia. So in other words, tilt toward the Indo-Pacific, but don't tilt so much that you sort of fall over. Again, the United States will have to maintain its commitments in other parts of the world, including because of what Americans care about. I mean, Americans care, I think, about forestalling Chinese hegemony in Asia, for example, but they also care about preventing terrorist attacks that originate in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, punishing and helping reverse blatant Russian aggression in Europe, deterring Iranian malfeasance, and securing energy supplies and sea lanes, and promoting policies to combat climate change, dangers to public health, helping developing nations improve their quality of life, all those kinds of things. And so again, this gets back to priority setting and how one allocates resources and attention across a broad portfolio of demands for U.S. actions. Let me say just a final, I guess, a few words about the sort of nature of relations between the United States and China as I see it, and how that plays into this broad, I'm trying not to scare anybody, this broad strategic impulse to, pivot to Asia rather than sort of pretend, as I think we have for a long time, to pivot to Asia. And I think it's a statement of the obvious that China and the United States are in a long-run competitive relationship. American policy now, and in contrast to previous eras, aims to respond to Chinese actions much more than to shape them, and certainly more than to try to transform China into a more liberal power through deep engagement, or even a more on the path to democratization, or even a more responsible stakeholder in the existing international system and so forth. A lot of this is seen as a response to Chinese actions rather than a way to transform those themselves. And I think that's right. A strategy grounded in that reality, one that combines a U.S.-led set of issue-based coalitions on areas that are important, that are specific to key interests, is now emerging to alongside those of our allies and partners with whom we need to be involved in, sometimes pushing back against Chinese assertiveness, other times shaping norms and rules in the region, other times allocating resources and so forth. There is, though, when you talk about this stuff, sometimes a glaring omission in America's China policy, and that is an objective. I've kind of annoyed some of my friends in the administration by writing that American policy toward China these days has almost everything you would want except a clear objective. We know what we don't want. We don't want repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We don't want militarization of the South China Sea. We don't want an invasion of Taiwan. We don't want we don't all these things. But what do we want? What's the long-term equilibrium that one can imagine? What's sort of the end game here? What are we aiming at? And key to this is, what are we asking our friends and allies to be enlisted in? What is this kind of effort all about, and what does it aim at? I think the administration in recent months has gotten closer to defining such an objective. You have to sometimes read between the lines of their statements. But I worry that without a more clearly defined goal, any overarching strategy is likely to waste resources, frustrate attempts to track progress, elude the domestic support necessary in the United States to sustain it, and also the support of allies and partners that is going to be necessary to sustain it. I mean, countries like Singapore and others wish and deserve, frankly, to know the objective of the coalitions in which Washington is increasingly seeking to enlist them. The fate of the U.S.-China relationship has global implications. I think that is also a statement of the obvious. And so the objective of U.S. policy should flow from the kind of world that we would want to see obtain, and the kind of threat that China poses to the order we would like to see obtain in the future. So, the United States has generally sought a global order that's governed by rules rather than brute power, one in which countries enjoy sovereignty, disputes are resolved peacefully, markets are open to trade, human rights are considered universal, democracy can flourish. Now, America's own track record in upholding all of this is hardly perfect. But the United States has nevertheless championed these things as ideals that should govern international behavior, and since the 1940s, the United States has opposed hostile spheres of influence emerging in Eurasia precisely because they threaten that rules-based order. So the overarching goal, I think, of U.S. policy toward China today should be rooted in this desire to preserve the core pillars of international order, even as the specific rules and institutions that make up that order change. So from that overarching goal, you can see a way forward, or at least an objective of U.S.-China relations, given China's growing military and technological power, its assertive behavior, its economic interdependence with the United States and with U.S. allies and partners, and the incompatibility of many Chinese actions with existing elements of international order. It seems to me that the aim of U.S. policy toward China should be to ensure that Beijing is either unwilling or unable to overturn the regional and global order. And there's a number of scenarios in which that objective might actually be obtained. China could cease trying to overturn elements of the liberal order if its leaders come to see the strengths of the countries that are committed to preserving it. Beijing might come to see its own future bound up in the preservation of some elements of this liberal order that's actually in their interests. Even if it doesn't, it might be incapable of undermining the order for any number of reasons, because of its own weakness, because of the unpalatability of its own authoritarian vision, because of a relative strengthening of the powers committed to the liberal status quo or something else. Now, a China that is unable or unwilling to overturn and undermine the regional global order, that is a pretty abstract goal for US policy. But it already excludes several possible alternatives. Under that kind of vision, the United States wouldn't aim to transform China into a liberal power or a responsible stakeholder in the international system. It wouldn't work toward Cold War style containment or regime change in Beijing. It wouldn't aim to stop China's rise per se, but rather oppose efforts by Beijing to disrupt existing international arrangements that are in ways damaging to the United States and its partners and allies. And then a medium-term kind of agenda, policy agenda, would flow from this. It would sort of naturally flow from this. The U.S. would seek to improve its military position in the Indo-Pacific relative to China. I think some of those efforts are underway. We can test China's use of economic coercion, build new technology partnerships to ensure the free flow of information, focus existing alliances on protecting democracies and friendly countries from external interference. And then you'd also have regional actions, enhancing security partnerships, and critically, embracing an ambitious trade agenda that goes well beyond IPEF. Ideally, the United States should re-enter CPTPP. If I was king and could wave a wand, we'd do it, but I'm not king and don't have a wand. If that remains a bridge too far for US domestic politics, then we should use IPEF as a stepping stone to something more ambitious than IPEF, but not as ambitious as CPTPP, a regional digital trade agreement, or at a minimum, a bilateral digital trade agreement with a country like Singapore, or a green technology, clean energy technology trade agreement with Singapore. But the point there is, like, let's do something. Now, Washington clearly isn't there yet on these trade issues, although I think there's movement on some of these other issues I mentioned, including on the upgrading of some of the partnerships and alliances, the military moves, some of the diplomatic efforts that one would need to make. But if you step back and look at the big picture, I think the United States is moving. I think it is actually pivoting to Asia and not pretending to pivot to Asia. I think this time it actually is for real. Now, that part of the impulse, again, is different than it was 12 years ago. It's not only to seize the dynamism of Asia and its economics and its demography and so forth, and to hedge against the rise of Chinese power. Much more of this is driven by the rise of Chinese power per se, but nevertheless, I think this is actually starting to happen. And this, I would submit, is encouraging. This region quite clearly is changing rapidly. The stakes are high. Given the importance of the Indo-Pacific, the centrality of Southeast Asia, the possibilities that attend various American alliances and partnerships like the close bond with Singapore, now I believe is the time for the United States at long last to pivot to Asia. But I look forward to your thoughts on that, so thank you very much.
As our colleagues here are thinking about what you just said and digesting the content of your talk, maybe I'll just get the ball rolling by, asking you a couple of, start-off question. I remember when the Bush administration came to power in 2001, before the September 11 attacks, the strategic focus of the U.S. was on China and great power contestation, peer competitor concerns, right? But after the September 11 attacks, there was this significant change of focus, and it seemed that the whole administration began to, as we know, refocus on countering terrorism, and we had the global war on terror. So my question is, do you see possibility in your own view that given other developments today, like I can think of two. Like for example, as we know, the ongoing concern with the Ukraine conflict. You mentioned that when the President Biden hosted the ASEAN officials, there was talk of a US 150 million package. At the same time, they're negotiating a 50 billion aid package for Ukraine. So to me, that suggests indication of a possible shift of priorities because of the changing geopolitical situation. That's one possibility. That's one scenario. Another scenario is, as we know, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, after the Taliban came back to power, August 2021, IS Khorasan has developed into a very significant threat, not just within Afghanistan, but it does have more international aspirations as well. It wants to develop the capability to strike outside Afghanistan as well, Western interest. So do you see potential possibilities that a shift away from Asia-Pacific could occur given further deterioration in the situations, for example, in the Ukraine conflict, or in the case of Afghanistan? Just to get the ball rolling. Thanks.
I think yes. Can you hear me? Okay. I think the short answer is yes. And that was what I was trying to get at a little bit in this. If there's, God forbid, a mass casualty attack in the United States that's traced back to Afghanistan, of course that's going to galvanize American attention and a major response. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has galvanized a major response. I think it's probably not right to, I did the same thing and compared $150 million for Southeast Asia to $50 billion for Ukraine, but of course Ukraine is at existential risk fighting for its life, and so, some of these things, it's just somewhat apples and oranges, but nevertheless, it shows that resources not being finite will need to be kind of allocated around different regions from the American standpoint. So how do you reduce the risk that you're going to have some major crisis emerge in a part of the world that is going to distract you from the focus on Asia that we've been trying to achieve all along? Well, this is what I was trying to say. I think paradoxically, it's not to abandon those regions, but rather to maintain a presence and a focus at a lower level in those regions. So for example, had we not ever left Iraq in 2011, I think the chances that ISIS would have taken over Iraq would be much lower, and we would not have had to wage a 5-year, very resource-intensive campaign to root out the ISIS caliphate. I worry that Afghanistan, had we left just a few thousand troops there, it certainly wouldn't have beat the Taliban, but it would have kept the government from falling. And if something goes boom in Europe this year, it may well be because it came from ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan. Are we going to do nothing about it? No, we'll probably do something about it. Well, what's the something? So there are preventive ways of dealing with this, and this is again why, and we need to keep troops in Europe and so forth. So I think you can do it. You can keep the focus on Asia, you can keep the focus on China, but the price of that is trying to dampen the possibility of acute security crises in Europe and the Middle East to the greatest possible extent, so you don't get once again pulled away. I guess the other thing I would just say is, Americans tend to have this view, once there's some sort of catalytic action or realization that everything we've been doing before was a total waste of time, money, and energy, and by God, we're way behind the ball and we need to do everything impossible to catch up. So, after September 11th, we said, oh my God, we've been wasting our time focusing on places like Russia and China. It's all about terrorism. Well, it was mostly about terrorism. It wasn't all about terrorism, and so we overreacted in some ways. And then, a couple of years ago, everyone sort of all of a sudden concluded, well, we've been wasting all of our time trying to do things like prevent al-Qaeda from attacking the United States. What a waste of time. That just bogged us down in the greater Middle East. Well, we should have been focused on China all this time. So now we've got to catch up and do that. And so this veering of, all of one thing or all the other thing is never particularly healthy. So it's that balance that I think is going to be the only sustainable way ahead.
Any questions from the floor? We have, I believe there's a roving mic. Yes, please. There's one here. Yep. In front. Here.
How do you see U.S. going to do all this?
Chris, I mean, for as courtesy, please identify yourself.
Chris, okay. I'm just curious. You talk about...
Chris, a bit more than that, Chris.
I'm an adjunct at the RSIS. My question is this. You talk about having finite resources. With the challenge of de-dollarization, I'm not saying that tomorrow everything change, but it will be a spectrum. Okay? As well as with your budget having problem, you can't even know what the debt ceiling will be. And we know that you also say US want to be everywhere. From optimization theory, when you want to optimize everything, you optimize nothing. In other words, if you want to please everybody, you actually please nobody. So I would like to hear your view. How would you see US should move from here? And then you also do not trick your friend like Singapore. When Biden invite all the so-called democratic country, you exclude my prime minister, not once, twice. So that is a slap on the face. Thank you.
Oh, just an easy question to get the ball rolling.
Thank you.
You can choose whatever part
You were
of the question
rather
you want to answer.
taciturn in your introduction of yourself, but rather verbose in the question that you delivered, so that's all good. I mean, in terms of the allocation of resources, I think part of the way to think about this is what are the areas and issues on which the threat, at least from the American and its allies and partner side, where is the threat the greatest, and therefore the resources necessary to buy down the risk or in order to address that possible threat is the greatest. So that's abstract, but for example, part of this is a product of bureaucratic incentives too, but you see in the United States now, because everyone talks about China all day long, you often see the arguments that the United States needs to be more engaged and spend more resources in Africa, because otherwise China's going to move in, and in the Western Hemisphere, because otherwise China's going to move in, and in the Middle East, because otherwise China's going to move in. But I mean, if you're trying to resist Chinese or Russian, for that matter, which Russia's active in many places around the world, if you're trying to resist their influence anywhere in the world by allocating your own resources, try to outbid them or to contest them anywhere in the world, it's just not necessary. So take a concrete example. You see China attempting to acquire ports, if potentially maybe naval bases at some point in places as far-flung as the South Pacific and Equatorial Guinea. Well, from an American perspective, preventing the Chinese from acquiring a base in the South Pacific is much more important than in Equatorial Guinea, because of the effect that would have on the ability of the U.S. Navy to operate in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the way. It's to think about the threats and the allocation of resources, and of course the opportunities in the allocation of resources, but in specific terms. So I think that's how you think about it. It tends not to be the way I think we think about it in the government oftentimes, because things are taken on an issue-by-issue basis. And if you sit around and say, well, there's some problem somewhere in the world, what should we do about it? Well, almost everything is worthy of some attention or some resources. But it's trying to make those cross-cutting decisions about what matters more than something else, because, of course, resources are always finite. I mean, I don't know, if you want to defend the full democratic nature of Singapore and why it should have been included in the Summit for Democracy, maybe we can invite some of our friends from the Biden administration that decided to convene that in the first place. But I don't really have an answer for you about how they made the decision about who met the threshold. I think anytime you decide that you're going to have a summit of only democratic countries from anywhere in the world, you're going to have some people left in and people in that people say, and people left out in the same thing. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer for you on that one.
That's right. Actually, one of the points which Chris brought up, the whole idea of, which is actually a wider discourse, right, about this democracies versus autocracies or authoritarian. That this discourse, and related to this, some analysts have been talking about, perhaps we are in a new Cold War, that kind of, discourse. I think most recently, the former British Prime Minister Truss talked about this as well, distrust. In your view, do you think that this is, particularly helpful kind of discourse? I mean, I can understand why some people are trying to compare the current US-China relationship to the US-Soviet relationship during the Cold War. Personally, I'm not too sure about it. I personally feel, just to share, I mean, if we use the terminology like New Cold War, it kind of hardwires an adversarial mindset into the bilateral relationship, which in a way then sets the scene for lack of a desire to communicate, which then sets the scene in turn for a lack of mutual understanding of one another's positions, which then ends up with a trust deficit, which then reinforces the adversarial mindset at the beginning. So, I don't know, my own view is that this democracy versus authoritarian discourse may not be entirely helpful, but I do realize and recognize that many analysts and scholars have different views on this. So I just wonder what you think.
You hear the democracy versus autocracy rhetoric from the president. In the national security strategy, they tried to complexify it a little bit, as academics might say, and said there's actually two kinds of authoritarians. There are revisionist authoritarians like China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. And then there's all the other authoritarians with whom we can actually work, because there might be authoritarian at home, but they're not revisionist abroad. And so they're kind of, I hate to say good authoritarians and bad authoritarians, but there was a little bit of that. I actually don't think that you see much of this reflected in actual policy. I mean, in this region, in places like Australia, people tend to get pretty anxious about that framing, because they said, isn't this a bad framing? And even if you want to team up against China, don't you need Vietnam? And Vietnam's not a democracy. And by the way, India is a democracy, but didn't sign up to sanctions on Russia, so it doesn't undermine your claim that, you know, this is all democracies on one side and all autocracies on another. Well, yeah. But I don't know that anybody is actually trying to act on that basis. I mean, the United States is trying to cultivate closer ties with autocracies like Vietnam or even Saudi Arabia. Compared to where that relationship was. There are democracies with whom the United States has a more troubled relationship than it has before, like Turkey and others. So yeah, this is the talking point. I think President Biden is genuinely committed to that kind of clarion call, but I don't see that actually manifested in policy much at all. I also don't think that the Cold War framing is useful if we think about it as a rerun of the previous Cold War. I think it's likelier to lead us astray than actually focus us on what we should actually be doing, in part because you had coherent blocks in the Cold War, right? I mean, those were political military blocks, but they're also economic blocks. I mean, the United States sold some grain to the Soviet Union, Pepsi was over there for a while, but you know, I mean, there was no real economic interdependence. There were a few countries that were kind of in the middle that did some trade, but mostly the Eastern Bloc traded with itself and the sort of Western Bloc traded and invested with itself, and of course you had these non-aligned countries and so forth. And so if we went around the world and said, okay, we're going to form a Western bloc. It's going to be a coherent political, military, economic bloc. We're going to trade and invest only with ourselves and not with whoever's on the other side. And by the way, China's on the other side. That's something the United States wouldn't even sign up to. Because, I mean, last year, the trade volume between the United States and China was an all-time high. So we have a very extensive economic relationship with China, just as every other, and by the way, we wouldn't get anybody else to sign up to it either, right? And so the way we think about these things has got to be much more complicated in the sense that we have strong economic interests in continued relationships with countries like China. At the same time, we have strong concerns about their geopolitical aims and their geopolitical and military behavior. And so that is different than the Cold War. And I think it's different in the Cold War in a way that bears sort of dealing with this on its own terms rather than saying, oh, China's the Soviet Union, the US is still the US, we're back in Cold War 2.0, okay, what do we apply from the lessons before?
Thank you. Yes, I saw. Yes, a question, a lady here.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for a very wide-ranging presentation. You mentioned South Pacific, and I mean, for the last...
excuse me, could you please briefly identify yourself?
I'm so sorry. Anna-Marie Schleich, also adjunct like Chris with RSIS. For the last couple of decades, the US was not really interested in the South and Southwest Pacific, which is actually strategically very important. The vacuum was filled by China, and only after the China-Solomon Island Pact, the strategic pact between those two countries, the US jumped in. And in the last 1.5 years, we've seen a lot of engagement, diplomatic and economic, by the US. But do you think that is enough and sustainable? The other small question I have is a lot of those South Pacific island countries do not like AUKUS. They are concerned about being drawn into a potential conflict between China and the US, and they also don't, because of historic reasons, don't like nuclear-driven US and possibly later Australian ships to go through their waters. Any comments on that?
Do you mind if I take a couple more questions?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Another 2 questions to this round. Okay, the gentleman next to, yep.
Hi, I'm Charlie from Booz Allen Hamilton. Coming from a... Sorry about that.
Anything to add to that?
Yes. Sorry. Coming from a think tank in D.C., what do you think of the discourse in D.C. versus what is happening in the region, what you're hearing and saying? Are they 2 different echo chambers, or is there a connection? And then how do you expect that to kind of manifest itself in a couple weeks at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where we'll have a defense-related gathering, which will maybe overshadow some of the other forms of the Indo-Pacific strategy? Thanks.
Thanks. And one more question for this round. At the end, the same row.
Hi, I'm Shafali from the Straits Times. That was an excellent talk, but I wanted to get your views on the emergence of global swing states. And do you see their significance growing in coming years, given the state of US-China relations?
Okay, great.
Okay, yep.
Great. So on the South Pacific, yes, it is true that the United States was not terribly involved in the South Pacific until it discerned a potential competitive advantage for China by its own engagement and then responded. But that seems like a natural response. I mean, what would we have done otherwise? So that seems pretty straightforward to me. I mean, we engaged once we discerned an interest in engaging. On the subs and AUKUS, and they don't like, subs traveling through their waters. Well, if the subs are doing their job, they won't know that they're traveling through their waters. I mean, that's the whole point of nuclear-propelled subs, is that they're undetectable. So I don't know that anybody is going to make a fuss about something they can't detect. Maybe not be the answer you were looking for, but I think that's the reality. I mean, countries might not like it, but it actually isn't. I mean, what are they worried about? I mean, the subs are not going to attack them. Discourse in D.C. versus the region. I think in D.C. there's, particularly on Taiwan, there's a certain casualness and inevitability about conflict between China and Taiwan that I think is wrong, and the worry in the region is certainly greater about the prospect of that and the desire to avoid it, and also the mechanisms by which I think folks in the region tend to think are appropriate to avoid it. So in Washington, I mean, for starters, you keep hearing everybody throwing out these dates. The war is going to start in 2030. No, it's 2027. No, it's 2025. People that generally don't know, right? But they're trying to, in part, create a sense of urgency on the American side to do what they believe would be necessary to increase deterrence, so that doesn't happen in the first place. And then, of course, there's also the focus on deterrence. So if everybody says, well, we don't want to go to war with China, so the answer to that is to increase deterrence. Well, yeah, that's true, but there's also the diplomacy aspect of this as well. And I think the diplomacy has been somewhat atrophied bilaterally over the past, year and a half or more, and some of the mill contacts and things like that. And I think that seems to be more acutely felt here in the region than it is in DC. And then, of course, if I step back, again, I guess responding to your question in the Taiwan scenario, but there are other ways one might respond to it. If I step back from it, think about it more as an analyst and reflect what I'm hearing in the region as opposed to the view from Washington, I think folks in Washington tend to be fairly convinced that China's changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, and the United States is trying to preserve it. Of course, the Chinese are convinced that the U.S. is changing the status quo with respect to Taiwan, and they're trying to preserve it. And I think it sounds like in the region they say, well, everybody just needs to calm down a little bit about this, because if both sides are convinced that they're maintaining the status quo but taking actions interpreted by the other side as changing it, then that's how you're going to get yourself into a potential fight. So that's a little bit of, I guess, some of the discourse, but one could go down that a little for. On global swing states, I don't know if that was a reference to something I wrote a decade ago, but you are the one who read it, so that was really great, because I don't know that many others who did. But a colleague of mine and I identified what we thought were some of the key global swing states, in the sense that they were countries that were going to play a disproportionately important role in upholding, or if they decided to, potentially undermining key aspects of international order, and that the United States should cultivate as having even closer relationships than they did before. We identified Indonesia, India, Brazil, countries like this. And I don't know whether those would be the same countries altogether, whether you would identify more. But certainly there are countries out there that I think do play, and I think Singapore is one of them, a disproportionate regional and global role that are therefore deserving of disproportionate sort of U.S. engagement, but that also want to be dealt with on their own terms, and not just as a function of competition between the United States and China. So you have to kind of put all of that together, but I think a focus on, from an American foreign policy perspective, on some of those states remains entirely appropriate.
Next round of questions. Okay, the young man in the gray suit, you can put your hand up. Yep. Please identify yourself.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fontaine, for your insightful sharing. I'm Alden, a student from Hwa Chong Institution, and my question to you is, given the United States' foreign policy pivot towards Asia, do you think that the United States' current foreign policy approach towards the Taiwan issue is that of strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity? And if it's still the former, do you think that the US should adopt a strategic clarity stance towards the issue? Thank you.
Okay. Next, couple more questions. Gentleman in front in...
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Min Zhang, I'm a journalist from Straits Times. If I heard you correctly, you mentioned a glaring omission in the US-Chinese policy is the lack of a long-term sort of equilibrium or objective. And if I understood correctly, you also said the US policy should be rooted in this desire to preserve this core pillars of the international order. But for my own interpretation, it seems like China is unhappy with this international order, especially with the proposal of, for example, the 3 Gs, the global development, global security, and global civilization initiatives, and its cultivation of the global south. And it doesn't think that the current order is benefiting all countries equally. And if so, this seems like two opposing sort of views. And does this mean it will inevitably lead to conflict? And if not, is the US sort of prepared to maybe accommodate or tweak some of these parts of this international order to accommodate China's rise? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One more question this round.
Hi, my name is Tricia Craig. I'm at Yale and US, and I work on US and European politics. I really appreciated the idea that if the US has an objective with respect to its China policy, some other sort of policy things flow. But I want to ask you about US politics and the possibilities of that, because when we talk about more trade agreements or sort of saying, it's fine for the US to set aside the rise of China, that's really not the rhetoric that is playing much in the US. And so I'm wondering, particularly as we go into an electoral season, how possible it is to get movement on things like trade agreements, and secondly, how much do you fear a change in administration would mean for a sort of pivot away from Asia and perhaps the rest of the world?
Thank you. What do you?
Sure. So first on strategic ambiguity, strategic ambiguity as a policy was designed to have a doubly deterrent value. On the one hand, China would be deterred from attacking Taiwan because the United States might defend Taiwan, and Taiwan would be deterred from declaring independence because the United States might not defend Taiwan. And that has kept the peace, or at least has been correlated with peace for a long time, and I think we abandoned that at our peril, and I don't think we would actually increase deterrence with respect to China if we went to strategic clarity, because I think the Chinese are actually already convinced that the United States would defend Taiwan anyway. So we wouldn't achieve any increased deterrence by trying to resolve that. What you do, though, is sort of sharpen what has been deliberately ambiguous for a long period of time. And this is where, the president now 4 times has come out and said publicly the United States would defend Taiwan, or he would defend Taiwan if it was attacked by China. Only once before has any president said such a thing. This was George W. Bush toward the beginning of his administration. He said it once, he didn't say it again for the remainder of his 8 years. President Biden said it 4 times, and each time the administration then runs out to say, well, actually they haven't changed policy at all. It's exactly the same. See how ambiguous "we will defend Taiwan if attacked"? Isn't that a perfectly ambiguous statement? Which to me I just don't understand that formulation. I mean, we may defend Taiwan and we will defend Taiwan, I think, are 2 different things. One ambiguous and one not. And so I think this policy of strategic ambiguity is the one to go with. The other problem with moving away from strategic ambiguity is, we don't have a mutual defense agreement with Taiwan, we don't have a treaty obligation with Taiwan, so it's sort of up to any president to define these terms, and if one president says we will defend Taiwan, the next president can come in and say we won't. And so it becomes kind of an issue that is continually potentially litigated in that sense. So so I'm more in the strategic ambiguity mindset. On these issues of global order and China's dissatisfaction with elements of global order, I mean, the term global order is abstract and vague and all this other stuff, so of course it all depends on what you're talking about. And I think there's probably not a global order. There's various global orders. There's a maritime order, there's a non-proliferation order, there's a human rights order as embodied in particular international covenants and agreements, many of which China is a party to. There are a variety. There are trade and economic orders. And so it depends on what you're talking about. So, what I think should be trying to preserve, for example, is the maritime order, the rules that govern, activities in the maritime domain. Now, if you're talking about institutions, which people also talk about as well, and China believes that it has insufficient weight in international institutions, then that's a different matter. And I think actually in some ways that's been accommodated in recent years. In some ways it has not. So I think you have to kind of disaggregate, but I don't see, if China wishes, for example, to claim the South China Sea in violation of the Convention on the Law of the Sea, how we accommodate that. We just oppose that because we don't accept that. Whereas, if this is about weight in institutions, it's a little bit different. We made it this far before anybody said who's going to be president of the United States in 2024, so I feel pretty good about that. I don't actually know the answer. If I did, I would tell you. But it's a great question about the politics of this and trade and everything else. I don't think I said that we should set aside the rise of China. If that was what I left you with, it was almost exactly the opposite. So, but on trade, I don't think that if the president decided tomorrow that we should get back into TPP, that it's likely they could get the Congress to agree to it right away. But I do think that you could get a digital trade agreement, a regional digital trade agreement, or a bilateral digital free trade agreement, or maybe a series of them. I do think that with a little political capital, you could get to that. And if you did get to that, then, and there wasn't a huge political backlash, which I don't actually think there would be, then that might demonstrate that it's a little bit safer now than it used to be to do more ambitious trade agreements, like eventually TPP. Now, I think this is largely abstract and theoretical, because I don't think President Biden wants to do those things. But I do think that if you look at some of the polling, the support for free trade is higher now. Free trade agreements is higher now than it's been in, almost since the global financial crisis. That's not totally indicative, because a lot of time it's the concentrated opposition to these things rather than the diffuse support for them. But, increasingly there are members of Congress that are asking people in the administration, well, every time we go to Asia now, we hear we don't have a trade policy. What are we doing about that? None of that has been catalytic enough to push this over the top, and I think there's a long way to go. But it's not the case that trade is politically impossible indefinitely in the United States. I just don't think that's the case. And then, this is sort of the biggest question of them all, is how much of any of this stuff sticks if we have another president? Well, in part it depends on who that president is, I suppose, but it looks like we're getting down to a pretty binary choice here pretty fast. So, if it's Biden, I think see a lot of obviously continuity with what they're doing now. But if it's Trump, there was on these issues, the issues we're talking about today with the, even on trade, unfortunately, there was a lot of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. I mean, the Biden administration's approach to China, to Asia, kind of writ large, and to trade are much closer to Trump than they were to the Obama administration. So I actually think on these issues, you would see a lot of continuity. I mean, I think the Trump administration did consciously try to prioritize Asia and things like that. Now, that administration was never a model of consistency, so you have to factor that in, and I think that would be the case in the future. But nevertheless, I think you'd actually have more continuity than one might otherwise expect.
Thank you. Next round of questions. Yes. Over there.
Hi, my name is Jefferson from RSIS. I have a question regarding the prospects of cooperation. Also, you talk a lot about the competitive dynamic between US and China, but what about the prospects for cooperation in terms of, you see, in terms of, especially for many of the global public goods that deal with, say, climate change, healthcare, and global health and things like that. I think while we talk about competition, there's also need for US-China cooperation in some of these areas. In 2014, when we talk about in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, US-China cooperation was very much instrumental to the signing of the Paris Agreement. What are your thoughts on the possibility that the Biden administration is thinking about some of these issues and the prospects for this sort of cooperation, at least in certain siloed areas? Yeah.
Another question? Oh, yes, in front here, gentleman in front.
Wolfgang Sachsenröder, I'm a German living in Singapore. I had two things I learned this week. The first one, historical, by reading a book on the colonialism. I found out that the United States were, for the first time, intervening in Southeast Asia as early as 1832, sending a gunboat to Sumatra in the Kuala Batu, which turned out to be a massacre. But my question is more on the new NATO enlargement into the Indo-Pacific. How would you put it into a perspective, and how would you interpret this move if you were not the chief of the Center for a New American Security, but the Center for a New Chinese Security?
Raf?
Thank you. Raffaello Pentucci, I'm a researcher at RSIS. I had two questions, slightly maybe linked or not, I don't know, you'll interpret as you will. First is, there's a lot of talk about the China-Russia partnership, alliance, friendship, however you want to term it. But the discussion's obviously focused on its role in Europe, and in Ukraine in particular. I wonder how you see that resonating out here in Asia, if you do see it at all. And then the other side of that question, you mentioned briefly India in your comments. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how DC sees India as a partner in Asia or on the world stage. In particular, back again to the reference that you made to India's views on the conflict in Ukraine, but more widely as a partner in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, great. So on the notion of cooperation between the United States and China, it's a mantra that you hear over and over again in Washington and many other places as well, that the relationship between the United States and China is going to be a mix of cooperation and competition, or as they now say, competition and cooperation. And that is true theoretically, right? I mean, it's sort of obviously true. I mean, there's no theoretical reason why, if we're competing with each other for influence in Southeast Asia, or One Belt, One Road versus something the Development Finance Corporation is doing, or military balance or anything like that, that we can't cooperate in areas where we share interests, like climate change and non-proliferation and global health and all these other things. So where's the competition? Where's the cooperation? And actually, you don't see any, zero, zip, zilch, like there's nothing going on really. And so why is that the case? Well, there's a few things I think going on. One, I think the Chinese leadership fundamentally rejects the delinking of these issues that is the U.S. preference. I mean, the United States would like to say, well, we compete vigorously in all these areas, but why not cooperate in all these others? But I don't think the Chinese will accept that. Two, this kind of spirit of competition infects the spirit of cooperation and turns many of the opportunities for cooperation into another vector of competition. So for example, when COVID breaks out, I mean, neither the United States nor China have an interest in COVID spreading. We all have an interest in developing vaccines. We all have an interest in putting a stop to this thing. So we cooperated, right? No, of course we didn't cooperate at all. All we did was use it as another avenue to compete with each other in terms of narrative and vaccine diplomacy and all these other kinds of things. Climate is maybe one area where I think you could see a form of cooperation, in part because active cooperation might not be as necessary as, for example, parallel commitments on emissions or things like that. And then, you know, but overall, I think you have to be skeptical about the possibilities of cooperation between the two, even in areas where there is an overlap of interest. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And if you go back to the example of the Cold War, which, as we said, is a very imperfect example. I mean, there were examples of U.S.-Soviet cooperation areas, polio vaccine and things like this, even at quite frosty moments of the Cold War. So it can be done, but it's not easy. It doesn't spring automatically from the convergence of interests. NATO enlargement in the Pacific, I mean, we should be careful. We're not talking about enlarging NATO. Nobody's joining NATO in the Pacific. They're talking about having an office in Tokyo. So I mean, and they invited NATO leaders to the Asian leaders to the last NATO summit. So I think there's more interest in Europe in what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, and more of, I mean, they say this in Europe, European countries discerning a challenge or a set of threats from China than used to be the case. And so they sort of take this as part of their ambit. So if I was running the Center for a New China Security, of course I wouldn't like the fact that NATO's putting an office or more offices in my region, or inviting leaders from my region to their alliance. But I might also take the opportunity to ask why they're doing that in the first place, right? I mean, you take some of the countries that are reacting in concrete and meaningful ways to what they see as, potential challenges from the rise of China: India, Japan, Australia, to some degree South Korea, some countries in Southeast Asia, the Philippines. So why are they doing this? I mean, is this some sort of, are the Americans so effective at putting everybody up to this? There's really nothing going on, but we've convinced everybody they should join some sort of anti-China coalition? No, I mean, I don't think that's credible. Is it an internal delusion that's motivating all these countries simultaneously? It's based on nothing? No, it's probably not the reason either. These are largely countries that would prefer to be non-aligned and demilitarized, but they're becoming increasingly militarized and increasingly aligned. Why? Because they're worried about threats to their security. And those threats are not coming from Canada, and they're not coming from, the South Pacific. They're coming from one country, that's China. And so there may be an opportunity for a little soul searching about why China has provoked this reaction. On Russia-China cooperation, so I think the question was really about Russia-China cooperation in Asia, is that as opposed to what we see in Europe. I mean, yeah, there's been some stuff, over the years, over recent years, freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, joint naval exercises. I'm sorry, not freedom of navigation. Sorry, I wish there were free. Let's say naval exercises in and around the South China Sea between Russia and China. So you've seen some things like that. But I mean, when we talk to folks in the region, it does not appear that Russia's activities in this region tend to be in the top 10 lists of things that most folks are very concerned about. India as a partner, I mean, this is one of these rare bipartisan initiatives that has been sustained really from probably the last year or two of the Bill Clinton administration all the way through today, to try to transform the nature of the U.S.-India relationship into a real strategic partnership. And that really has been sustained across administrations of very different kinds, across Indian governments of very different kinds. And so it actually, I think, is a real success story in a lot of ways. it also has its limits. Sometimes in Washington, people can get romantic about the possibilities of the U.S.-India relationship. I don't think we're going to become military allies and fight on one another's behalf. You know, the Indians and we don't have the same position on Russia and Ukraine, at least with respect to sanctions. You can point out all these kinds of differences, but there is a convergence of of interests and an alignment of the way we're seeing the region on some key areas. I mean, China's one of them, but some of these questions of regional order and so forth, diplomatic coordination, technology exchange and things like that. So there are a lot of possibilities. You just have to be realistic, not romantic about those.
Thanks. On the issue of cooperation between the great powers, which some of my colleagues here have talked about, a couple of years ago there was an interesting article in Foreign Affairs, I believe by Richard Haas and Charles Kupchan, about the global concert of powers idea, where he was harking back to the 19th century European concert of powers. So the whole idea was to get a few, 6 countries, if I'm not mistaken, US, China, Russia, India, Japan, and the EU to be the concert of powers which will essentially work behind the scenes in a politically inclusive manner, a very flexible mechanism, closed-door diplomacy to essentially support the formal international organizations like the UN, WHO, etc., in implementing policies more effectively. It was interesting. The article, the authors mentioned that regional groupings like OAS, ASEAN, Arab League, African Union could essentially support this global concert of powers. And this whole idea, this whole mechanism would be like a more, it's not fully institutionalized, it's informal mechanism, but they hang around longer than say G7 and G20 to actually get things done. So my question is, what do you think about this idea? Number 2, is this idea being discussed in Washington? I'm just curious.
Richard and Charlie are both friends of mine, and it's been a while since I've read their articles, so I don't want to, make it into a caricature or something like that. But I mean, in a way, the G20 has kind of been trying to approximate that. And actually, if you look at the response to the global financial crisis and the G20's response, I mean, it was a little bit of, I wouldn't call it a concert, but it was a kind of a steering committee for fiscal policy, fiscal response, monetary policy, and things like that. I think the realities of US, Russia, and China all being part of that grouping have made it extraordinarily difficult. And so, you didn't see the G20 really active in the COVID response, for example, which was another, major global crisis. So I think that those kind of geopolitical realities put huge obstacles in the way. I haven't heard too much about that recently. So.
Next round of questions.
Chris with RSIS.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is, imagine a scenario, if come the next election in Taiwan, they say 80% of the people say we are going to be pro-China. How would this pivot to Asia equation change? That's question number 1. Question number 2, if there is a replay of 2007, 2008 financial crisis again, we know that US, the financial sector, as well as in Europe, right now is facing real challenge. Okay, I think your Treasury Secretary had said, okay, especially if the debt ceiling cannot be fixed. How would you see all this will change the pivot to Asia? Thank you.
Oh, you want to take the other ones? Or?
Yeah, any more questions this round? Okay, I think there's still, okay, one here.
I'm going to throw you a softball to assist. I'm Captain Hugues Canuel. I'm the Canadian Defense Attaché here in Singapore. Thanks for a great talk. So as a Canadian, I'm going to go back to allies and partners. You mentioned that a couple of times. Lots of allies and partners are also undertaking their own pivot to Asia, including Canada. We've put out an Indo-Pacific strategy back in November. It so happened that I've just welcomed 2 Canadian warships who've just arrived in Singapore this morning. What are your thoughts on what forms of engagement by some of those allies and partners in this region would be helpful, would contribute to the larger effort in reestablishing stability and such things, sir. Thank you.
Any final question is from, oh yes, at the back, right at the back.
Good afternoon. I'm Kenneth from RSIS as well. My question is really, over the past few years, did we see a de-emphasis on counterterrorism in the US landscape? And even if there is an emphasis on counterterrorism, it's more likely towards domestic terrorism-related issues. So do we expect an increase, or can we expect an increased level of cooperation in counterterrorism within this region, facilitated by the US? Thank you.
Okay. So Chris from RSIS, the first question was if next year when there's an election, 80% of the Taiwanese say they're pro-China, what does that do to the pivot? I just don't think that's likely. I mean, I don't know how we would get from what the polling shows now to 80% saying they're pro-China by next year. But let's say, for the sake of argument, they did that. What would they do about that? I guess that would support the KMT's candidate. The KMT's candidate would win. And when President Ma was president of Taiwan, there were great U.S.-Taiwan relations then, too. So I don't think that matters to the pivot to Asia. Per se. Now, a global financial crisis, it's interesting. I'm writing this book with my colleague, Ambassador Bob Blackwell, who was ambassador to India, and some other things on the pivot to Asia, and we've gone back and looked at some of the original stuff. And it is interesting to see, for example, when Barack Obama went to the Australian Parliament and announced, that was kind of a big statement about the United States is pivoting to Asia, one of the rationales that the United States, that he offered, was because it's going to help create jobs to replace those lost after the global financial crisis. And this is my #1 job and things like that. So certainly if there's a global financial crisis, 2.0 or whatever, then that puts everything in peril. I mean, because you would have the major political priority of dealing with that at home and with our friends and allies and things, and of course you would have the potential resource constraints. I mean, even the United States after a while can only print so much money, so and borrow so much. So yes, that has the potential to really kind of upend lots of things. This question of engagement of other allies and partners in the region, I think is really critical. I think it's critical for a couple of reasons. One, what the United States, I think, is trying to do in terms of the balance, the presence in the region, upholding a regional order, is not just an American enterprise. It's a shared enterprise. And particularly if you have countries like Canada or those in Europe that are active in this part of the world, I think it helps demonstrate that, in fact, that is a shared enterprise. It's not just, something that is kind of cooked up in Washington, but it's a shared set of concerns, and that there are countries that are actively putting, their sort of skin in the game out here as well. Sometimes on the military side, there'll be a little bit of dismissiveness. Well, but this is less Canada, but Europe, right? They'll say, well, the Brits can sail a carrier task force, group through the Indo-Pacific, or the French can, send something in, or the German Air Force can come in. But really, what does that add or subtract to the military balance? What would that actually mean? And, for deterrent purposes, what would it actually mean if you ever got into a dust-up? Keep it all in Europe where it could actually make a bigger difference. I actually think exactly the opposite. I think, one, because of the signaling that does of this kind of unified front of what it is we're trying to achieve in this part of the world. But the other is, these are not severable activities from all of the other areas where we need our partners and allies to be working alongside us, and particularly on the economic and technology side. So if we went to the Canadians, the Europeans, or whoever, and said, well, we want to harmonize all our positions on technology and economics and diplomacy and all these other things, but leave all the Paul Mills stuff to us. We'll take care of that in the Indo-Pacific. I just don't think that's a sustainable approach to our partners' allies. It doesn't actually give them the sort of place that they have earned at the kind of broader table in terms of the foreign policy approach to this region. So I think it's really important, and the United States, for its own part, should be encouraging as much of that as possible, and also encouraging as much of that without the United States being involved. It's not the case the United States has to be at the table for everything. They have to be organizing everything. I mean, a lot of these things that happen without us are good for us, and so that's what I think there. Counterterrorism, it's a question that we were just talking actually before this about how much over the years counterterrorism has retreated as a primary issue. I mean, I see Fort Hart in the audience who has forgotten more about China than I will ever know, but I had the great privilege for a short time of working alongside him on the National Security Council staff, and I was doing some Southeast Asia stuff. But, no matter what country from Southeast Asia, no matter what officials were coming to town, you always knew the number one issue was going to be terrorism that we wanted to talk to them about. And sometimes that was appropriate, and sometimes maybe we should have, kind of rethought that prioritization. But now we've gone so much in the other direction where, actually the number one issue with almost everything is China, right? And you want to talk to Guatemala, what are you going to talk about China? No matter what country it is. But terrorism matters, and terrorism, I think I do worry particularly about Afghanistan, but, there's been a lot that has been done since 9/11/2001 to bring the threat of radical extremism or violent extremism down to the level now where people don't have to think about it very much, and that's where we want to keep it. So what I would like to see is, mostly kind of quiet, behind the scenes cooperation on counterterrorism that makes this sort of, it helps keep it to a level where the average person doesn't have to fear this kind of stuff the way that 20 years ago we did.
Final round of questions. Anybody would like to ask? I think you have blown them away, Richard.
That's one interpretation.
It's the correct interpretation. One final question, which I think I was actually hoping to ask, and I'll do it now, is in previous workshops and sessions which we have RSIS has organized for the past couple of years, one thing which strikes me personally whenever we have engagements, say between Chinese and American think tank colleagues, is sometimes it seems like the Chinese side don't really fully understand how U.S. domestic politics works. So they tend to, one or two of them tend to get very uptight about something which they say a U.S. congressman says, and then somebody needs to say that, that's just that congressman's point of view, doesn't necessarily represent the entire U.S. administration. So I wonder to what extent this is understood in Washington, that perhaps a bit of explanation of how the U.S. system of checks and balances, separation of powers actually works, and is this understood within Washington? Because I think that's really part of the communications issue.
Yeah, we really saw this as an issue with the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, right? So, I personally was subject to kind of the messaging from Chinese officials that said, Biden shouldn't let Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan. And we said, we got three branches of government, and they're co-equal, and she's the Speaker of the House, and he can't really stop her. And they said, we told the White House, don't let her go. Again, there's three branches of government, and this other kind of stuff. And for some, I think it's not beyond the realm of human understanding to understand that our system is the way it is. But that just didn't matter. And then others, I think, kind of said, maybe that's kind of the formal reality. But the reality really is, if Biden had said, Nancy, don't go, she wouldn't have gone, and he didn't do that. So it's kind of his fault at the end of the day anyway. But yes, of course, a better understanding of our own system would be beneficial for everybody. I mean, in a very different context, we get this with the Iranians right now. So we can't get back into the Iranian nuclear deal. And the Iranians have come to the United States and said, look, you guys pulled out before, so we need a binding guarantee that you'll never do that in the future. Well, what does that look like? We don't have a supreme leader. So, you could try to get a treaty, which you'd never get to the U.S. Senate, but even a treaty, you can pull out of a treaty. You can't bind the hands of the U.S. democratic political system into the future forever. You just can't. So, but of course, by the same token, I think the ability for Americans to understand the inner workings of the Chinese system is like an order of magnitude harder than it is for Chinese to understand the American system, because at least we're open about most of these things. It's kind of all out there for everybody to see, and some of this can be a matter of interpretation. But it is quite difficult often to understand the basis for Chinese decision-making, you know, kind of within the government and how that's all being done and things like that. So it sort of goes in both directions.
Well, all right. I think we've come to the end of our afternoon session and presentation discussion. I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have had a master class on the whole issue of the extent to which the U.S. is very serious in its pivot to the Asia-Pacific region. It's a real pivot, and it's not an attempt at pretending. So I think at least I'm convinced. So. Thanks very much, Richard, and please join me in thanking Richard Fontaine for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.